Hello, everyone. Welcome to Closers Coffee. I'm your host, Carlos Figuerella. On this episode of Closers, we're talking with Kim Raath, founder and CEO of Topl. Topl is an impact technology company with a vision to change the world for better, collaborating with a multitude of partners to power impact projects across the globe by building a blockchain ecosystem to improve ethical and sustainable practices for various industries. Kim leads a diverse team with over 40% women employees and recently closed their funding round to scale their business. This Closers episode is sponsored by Outfield. Outfield is an industry-leading CRM for sales and marketing organizations across the globe. Outfield helps teams optimize their sales process, gamify their productivity, and increase revenue. Download the Outfield app now and use the promo code CLOSERS for 10% off. Hey everyone, welcome to Closers Coffee. Super excited to have Kim Raath with us today. Kim is the founder and CEO of Topl and has recently completed her PhD from Rice University. Kim, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Jumping into this, tell us more about Topl and your company's mission.
Yeah, so we refer to ourselves as an impact technology company. And what we've done is we actually built a blockchain from scratch that helps businesses prove their ethical and sustainable practices. And so when it comes to mission, it is, we always talk about our slogan is there's a lot of companies changing the world right now, and we're just helping them prove that.
Wow. And so, jumping into blockchain, like I'm excited to unpack all of that, but this journey really all started for you kind of through your personal journey, right? Your upcoming and upbringing. So tell us a little bit about your background and you growing up.
Yeah, so I'm originally from South Africa.
Awesome.
And so as I was growing up, I was actually so my dad's an executive in the mining explosives industry.
Gotcha.
My family comes from the mining industry, primarily a lot of agriculture too. So grew up in the diamond space.
Yeah.
Only really understood it truly and what can happen in these areas and what's going on the ground in a lot of the regions just in Upper Africa of what's going on when it comes to conflict, diamonds, and when it comes to actual labor practices in agricultural space. But what really kind of hit home is while I was growing up in South Africa, I was recruited here on a track scholarship.
Gotcha.
And so we kind of start different seasons than you guys. So there was about 10 to 12 months actually between when we finished high school and when the US started school.
Okay.
And so I joined a South African organization that does mostly disaster relief implementation all around the world.
Gotcha.
So I went to about 18 different countries.
Wow.
Where we would do, so like in Thailand, we did tsunami rebuilding.
Okay.
In Guatemala, we did some mudslide rebuilding. In Bosnia, we worked a lot with some of the orphanages where the gypsy children that were kind of, the 90s war kind of left alone.
Wow.
Same in India, I actually worked in a lot of different orphanages. And what we were really doing as the South African organization, no name brand, we were helping bigger organizations move money into these regions. And so essentially helping them implement different projects, helping them actually distribute the money and then essentially buy the goods and then report back the outcomes of what's going on in these regions. And so I was very fascinated with how do we really report impact back to the source that is funding, different types of projects. And at the same time, we were mostly in very remote regions with mostly farming communities, mostly communities that are very, disenfranchised and weren't really taken care of. And they were usually a part of some supply chain. And they were like the first mile of the supply chain.
Yep.
And so I was completely fascinated with how I could have, I was one of the people in the team that had an iPhone. And this was 2008, 2009, you're right, iPhones, just came out and everyone was super excited about it. And I was able to access the internet, from like a McDonald's in the middle of nowhere. And so I got fascinated with network topology, which is kind of where the word Topl originally came from, is network topology. I'm not going to take credit for the word. It came from my co-founders, which I can tell all about that. But the ultimate concept of how do you connect the most disenfranchised individual with their information and what's happening on the ground, all the way to the biggest corporation on the other side that's selling the brand of coffee that farmer is, providing for us to drink.
Sure.
And so with that fascination, I came to the US, studied math, hence network topology. And then from there actually came, I was fascinated with a professor at Rice, Rebecca Richard Cordham. She's in the bioengineering department, and she had started Rice 360, which is a global health institute at Rice.
Okay.
And what they were doing is they were taking the technologies designed by undergraduate point of care diagnostic technologies, and they were taking them into very rural areas and thinking through how to make them more robust, how to scale them up and roll them out into neonatal wards in the middle of nowhere. And so I really wanted to work for her. And in 2014, I just sent her a message, and I reached out and I said, hey, would you be willing to have me volunteer for you? And she emailed me back. That year, she was actually on the Fortune 50 list, most influential people in the world. So she got back to me, and I started working for her shortly after. Started working for Rice 360, and that's kind of my journey to Rice. And that's how I made it to Rice. So I actually worked at Rice first.
Okay.
And that's how the evolution kind of came when I started asking her and the other founder of Rice 360, Maria Oden, one of the professors also in the bioengineering department, how are we going to solve the problem of really reporting the information from what's happening in these neonatal wards? How are we going to solve the problem of we saved X amount of babies at birth? How can we real time capture some of these information? And at that time, it was also the same year when Reuters came out with a lot of the greenwashing articles that started showing up in Nestle's supply chain, they were slaves and they were children. So those types of things started really pushing hard, that they were people were lying about their actual certifications, their actual ethical and sustainable practices. Or not necessarily lying, they just didn't know the truth.
Sure.
Of what's happening at the source.
Lack of transparency in all of it.
Exactly. So even the end brand and corporations, they were paying for specific certifications, but they had no clue whether things were really happening as they claimed they were happening. And so I became fascinated with how do we solve this problem? And shortly after I started my PhD at Rice, Rebecca and Maria kind of said I had to go solve this problem myself. And so I enrolled in a joint program at Rice, which is a statistics PhD and a master's in economics.
Wow.
And it's underneath the Center for Computational Finance Economics, which economic systems is what they call it, and COFFEES. So that's where I met my two co-founders. So COFFEES is kind of the hub for various different fields. So you have, comp sci, physics, economics, stats, all of us kind of sit under the center. And we had a bunch of blockchain and crypto conferences. And Chris and James, my two co-founders, actually were at one of these conferences. And Chris was one of my class. He was this ambitious undergrad who took PhD level courses. And so he was in one of my classes. And so we were at this conference, and he never stopped talking. And so I remember distinctly telling my husband, this kid's going to do something. I need to stay close.
Yeah,
and
you can see him shining.
Yes, he was just one of those. And so at this conference, I had found out that the two of them were actually part of a startup out of Allspark at Rice that was building a payment application using Ethereum, the Ethereum blockchain.
Sure.
And I just had started learning about blockchain just this 2014, 2015. And so kind of asked them a lot of questions and started asking if, some of the problems I had seen could be solved by using this technology. And that's very much what it is, right? And that's where we started really thinking through how do we solve a complex problem using an emerging tech But what really united us was the mission around how do we solve a problem using something as complex as a blockchain. And so it took us about 2 years before we really got to where we wanted to be.
Sure.
But it was 2017 when we started the company and said, no one else is going to do this. We better do this.
Wow.
So yeah.
Yeah. So you set out on your own personal journey to really make an impact and go out there and seek a problem, find a solution. And so then that's brought you all the way from South Africa to Arkansas.
Yes.
To Rice and here in Houston. And then it ended up meeting your co-founders. So that's a lot of dots to connect.
Yes. So you know what's the scariest golden thread?
What's that?
So I went to Arkansas State.
Okay.
My PhD advisor at Rice also went to Arkansas State, studied the same thing as me, and her sister started the track team, was the first female track athlete at Arkansas State. And I was a full scholarship track and field athlete at Arkansas State.
Wow.
So yes, so think about golden thread, but yes, Dr. Enser literally I don't know how I followed her, but yes, it just magically happened. And we, she became my PhD advisor here at Rice. And so we're both Arkansas State graduates. So it's not that far connected, but yes, we both made it to Rice. And it's pretty fascinating journey, but yes, it's not normal, connecting the dots. I always say that, I went to travel the world because I wanted to change the world, but the world changed me. Yeah. And then it put me on this path to find a solution to something that I still think needs a lot of work. But yeah, I think I found some amazing people that are solving this problem with me, and I'm glad I did.
So tell us, how are you using blockchain?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always tell people is, it's more an enabler or it empowers. But I think a good example, seeing that we're talking about coffee, let's start with coffee.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest things that is happening within and I mentioned it a little bit earlier too, but one of the biggest issues that happens when you're trying to collect certifications or actual claims that are happening alongside a supply chain's journey, you always want to do three things. You want to actually collect the physical, the digital twin of that physical good.
Okay.
You want to be able to track the payments that are moving in opposite direction, and you want to be able to track the associated characteristics or claims that are being made. But sadly, all three of these things currently run in different systems. Okay. So you'll have an SAP system that might track the digital twin of the physical asset. You'll have, a payment method, be it if it's a remote, area like Ethiopia where you're using mobile wallets to do payments. Most of those producers are unbanked. And then you're also using a certification process that each certification process have their own system that you have to report to. And it's always after the fact. It's never real time. It's never tamper proof. You can always manipulate the data after the fact. And so one of the things we really wanted to enable is to say, how do you do all three of those things at the same time? Right? How do you actually record the physical twin of that digital the digital twin of that physical asset? So say you're moving coffee from a farmer, and the farmer wants to be able to, relay the information of where those cherries were picked. That farmer can use an app that's powered by Topl that allows them to take a picture of the cherries for that day. And so when you're taking a picture of the cherries for that day, you're able to have a geotag associated with this. And this is specifically the farmer's app. So they're logging in with their biometrics.
Sure.
Right. And so that geotag is associated with that batch of cherries that he then delivers a few, hours later to the washing station. At the washing station, it's weighed, and the washing station is logging in on their application and recording the amount that farmer just delivered. Also an app that's powered by this underlying technology, and this washing station is recording associated claims that are being made about the product itself. But what is happening in reverse there, because you're actually in this underlying network, is the reverse information that's going back is the farmers being told, you just delivered X kilograms of good. Today's market price is Y. You should have received this much in your mobile wallet. Did you? And only at that point is living wage farming recorded.
Wow.
As a certification on that batch of goods. And so that geotag continues with that product, and then it makes it to the next point where you start having the roasters, and then you go all the way to the brand itself. Now, where it becomes extremely interesting, where blockchain empowers even more so, is that in this situation, when the farmer is paid, blockchains can enable you to send 90% back to the farmer, and 10% can be held in escrow, so that those farmers can work together as a cooperation to actually build and buy their own roasters, so that they can start roasting themselves and actually become more sufficient and actually do more and earn more with what's going on. Not just that, as the journey continues, as you're actually tracking that story, the story tracks all the way to you as a consumer. So when you're scanning that little QR code on the bag of coffee you buy, you're able to actually see the whole story back from the farmer to the frappe that you're drinking.
Wow.
And so what that enables is that production history allows that unbanked farmer for the first time to actually have history, credit history, that now could eventually be used for alternative credit score, so that they can start getting financing, loans, insurance. So it enables new activity to start happening, just because now, for the first time ever, you have connected the most disenfranchised individual on the one side through the same censorship-proof network to the other side, where you have the big corporation being the brand itself, or even you as consumer. So that's how we are using blockchain. And what Topl's blockchain does is to enable those three things to happen simultaneously. The digital twin, the transaction, and the claims can all be tracked simultaneously, like funds, goods, and the impact associated with those good movements.
Wow.
So that's kind of like how we've been using blockchain, and how we foresee blockchain being used, and beyond, as we go into, the 2030 Sustainability Development Goals. How are we going to track the associated impact that's happening within bigger companies? How are we going to report ESG? How are these supply chains going to be able to claim certain SDGs, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, underneath their ESG pillars? Like, how can you actually have a physical claim happening on the ground and a digital twin of that claim with proof of it, and have a defensible self-certification at the time it happened? So that's where we're going.
Yes, you're literally breaking down silos and helping the disenfranchised have more access to information, resources, and really understand fair market price, which is something that they've been. Information asymmetry, right?
Yes. Like, as much as we do not know information about the first mile and what's going on at first mile, they do not know the information of what people are really paying for their product and what they have actually done. So it's opening up so that there's information symmetry, and then essentially connecting the dots where institutional voids previously existed.
How your technology is really like changing the four corners of the world. No one ever thinks about the first mile. Everyone thinks about, in this day and age of instant gratification, everyone wants it now, wants it available readily. But no one thinks about the pain and the struggles of what that person had to do to get that, from farm to frappe.
Yes, no, and I mean, with us, like, we have a value-driven actual consumer base now. Like, if you look at where most consumers sit and what generation they sit, we have, consumers that are research-driven, that are actually searching information about the companies they're buying from. We have a generation that's boycotting brands that are claiming certain things and not keeping to those standards. We have a cancel culture, right? Is that people actually taking action and making sure that our brands, our products are taking value-driven decisions to make sure that, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to actual, ESG, claims. You change the world, we'll prove it. Like, let's make sure you can actually prove what you're claiming is existing. Because there's extreme measures of greenwashing still going on now, where people are just making sure that they say certain things without actually doing them.
Sure. Talk a little bit about the Internet of Value and how does blockchain fit into that?
Yeah, well, blockchain is actually the Internet of Value. Blockchains are actually just a thin layer, like a protocol written on top of the Internet as we know it now.
Okay.
That is just higher security that allows us to do specific things like transact value. And in that sense, I mean, we can literally peer-to-peer transactions. It's like Venmo without a bank checking.
Got it.
You actually have the math checking whether the transaction between us is valid. So the cryptography, this is where the word crypto comes from in the space, is actually checking whether the transaction between us is valid. And so that's so when it comes to simple transactions like these, but then you can even go further where you and I can exchange a title of a house without an actual third party having to validate whether that is true or not, because you can streamline the whole title contract because it has a templatized, structure with, if-then statements or check-the-box statements. And those are all things you can digitize on-chain. So you can create a real value exchange between you and me where we can literally sell a house without having to have a third party involved, which costs a fortune.
Absolutely.
Most title companies would not like me saying these things, but yeah. So that's kind of the world that we're starting to see, is the ability to exchange value. And this could be any type of value. I mean, we're tracking, one of the groups that, has been tracking some stones, diamonds on the Topl blockchain. And so you can think of the digital twin of a diamond has specific characteristics. And so you can actually have various different characteristics. So it can be the physical birth location of that stone, the actual type of mine that stone came from, the actual labor practices of that mine, the environmental practices of that mine. All of those characteristics can be placed inside that digital twin of the physical asset.
Wow.
So this is why Nike and them are essentially saying, okay, so the shoe is made up of all these different pieces. It has all these different social and environmental practices that go in that we need to be able to validate and show where things came from. But yeah, there's a different world where that also becomes a question of, there's two questions that people always ask. Giga is one of them, garbage in, garbage out.
Sure.
Right? How are you validating whether this information is actually correct? Could someone not just put some rubbish in at the source? And then the other piece of this is, how are you protecting the actual disenfranchised? Because what's a lot of the blockchain solutions that are starting to come about are private solutions. They're not allowing, the farmer to therefore pay. They're only allowing the bean to brew to be tracked. And so it's cutting out the farmer and cutting out the consumer.
Sure.
So it is not completely open for anyone to write. And that's where, the things that are extremely important in the blockchain space, or what we at least think are extremely important, is data democratization. Is that everyone should be able to control their own data. It shouldn't be something that your data can be monopolized against you, because you're now, part of this very long chain, and you're inputting data, but you have zero control what happens to that data.
Wow.
So that's where, really opening up this, where anyone can write to the same network. And where at the same time, trustless transparency, you want people to be able to read from that same internet, just like a Google search. You need to be able to find specific behaviors that are happening, just like you need to be able to have anyone add to the internet and not have someone manipulate that against them. So trustless transparency is kind of that next point. And these are two words that James always uses: data democratization and trustless transparency. And then the long-term game here, which we talked about earlier, is long-term accountability.
Sure.
Is essentially creating these histories that are time series, that are repeated time series, that start giving you a sense of what's going on in these different, supply chains. Some of these big companies might not want to have, full transparency. They might want to control that transparency. So the question becomes like, and you can have private, chains where you have, anyone can write to it, but you can't read everything, and you can control who reads that, the permissions.
Got it.
But the world itself of blockchains are becoming way more, it's an emerging tech, just like AI and machine learning. It's an enabler, and it's the question of what you're doing with it. So yeah, I think like the big takeaways for this is, what do blockchains enable? And I don't know where that's going to go, because some people might not want to see transparent histories of what happened in their supply chains, but some people might, because they want to see visibility into what actually went wrong and why it went wrong, even internally, even if you kept that information private.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because as we move towards, that digital life, right, and our presence being more in the digital space, how do things get assigned value on the internet? How do, say, as we jump into virtual reality, right? How do we get our favorite sneakers to be in there with us? How do we customize everything? And then how do we exchange?
Yeah.
How do we,
It's like a derivative product.
Yes.
And I'm a financial engineer by training, so I also shouldn't just say that, but it's literally that. It's like the digital twin of that physical good is a derivative product. It has unique characteristics that is associated with that physical good. So a lot of when we talk about, corn derivatives and bean derivatives, these are actually just like representations, digital representations of the physical goods.
Wow.
And we're trading them. And so this is exactly what you're talking about, is that, yes, when you start going into these virtual worlds, you can think about having like, a unique asset that has unique characteristics. But then think about the other problem, and that's what blockchains really solve, is double spending. Because I can just duplicate your digital asset and sell it at the same price you're selling. So how do I make sure that there's only one of it? How do I not double spend? How do I not buy, that's one of the biggest problems that blockchains are solving, is the double spending problem, is I can't sell you the same thing that I sold someone else.
Gotcha.
And that's where banks actually do come in when it comes to the Venmo transaction. My bank's actually checking whether I have the money and I can send it to you. And your bank's checking whether your account's legitimate. And that's where the fees come in and why we have to pay them. But now with increased security measures and these, like, what blockchains are solving, by solving that double spending problem, that no longer can I send you and someone else money. I can only send it once.
Gotcha.
No longer can I send you the Nike shoes and someone else sell it to someone else as well. Yeah, so that's actually one of the big issues, is like, if someone makes a digital twin of a physical good, how do you make sure there's no two of it? I mean, if we want to be more tangible, carbon credits.
Got it.
How do you make sure that, there is, someone is sequestering carbon in this like farmland in the middle of nowhere, and there's X amount of, carbon credits coming out of that ground. How do we know the repository is depleting and they're not just like dishing out those carbon credits to everyone? And those are the things that, that's this non-tangible pieces is what becomes interesting in like creating digital twins. So if you move away from the physical asset actually being a physical asset and it actually becoming an intangible thing, where it is like carbon.
Yes.
How do you create a digital twin of that intangible thing? And how do you make sure that if you're using like a measure, like a carbon like sequestration measure, a carbon capture measure, it's depleting over time, like the report. And this is the biggest issue in the carbon credit space, by the way, is that how do I know I'm not double spending?
Wow. And so obviously blockchain is part of driving that initiative, right? Trying to get towards, climate change and
so that's one
zero
of the biggest
carbon.
things. Yes, exactly. It's like blockchains can truly enable a zero carbon or carbon neutral future, because they can actually help you, one, capture the offset, so tell you like and measure your offsets, and you can unitize them and know exactly how much carbon emissions you have, and then sell those units of measure in return for voluntary carbon credits, or offset them with different types of sources, and be able to have a carbon neutral environment.
Now, that's really cool to see how blockchain is just evolving and really helping industries. Kind of coming back to Topl, tell us more about your mission, your vision, and the goals that you're out to set with the company.
Yeah, so for us is, I always talk about in mission, vision, we are social entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So ultimately, what we've seen from a vision perspective, it's about building an ecosystem where companies that are driven for purpose and profit, we call them zebras. It's kind of the black and white, so purpose and profit driven, can herd, right? So you can actually build an ecosystem where purpose and profit driven companies, zebras, can gather together and together move the status quo. So instead of being like a big unicorn, we can be a bunch of zebras that move the whole status quo from where we are now, and becoming more conscious consumers, more conscious capital, and driving that needle forward to become a purpose and profit-driven environment. So that's kind of where a lot of this vision had come from for us. It was really driving a technology that can enable zebras, that allows those that are changing the world to prove what they're doing. And so the mission behind all of this has been very much like trustless transparency, really getting transparency for all. Like, how do we build an environment that allows everyone to participate? Sure. From source to sale, every piece of the journey gets to be a part of the journey. So that's kind of where we started, and the evolution has just taken off from there. Right.
Talk a little bit about the evolution.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier. I talked about my co-founder. So the three of us started the company together. Chris and James have, when we started the company in 2017, we were originally, we did this like coffees pitch. Chris did a pitch where we started bringing this idea to life. It was a big evolution. It definitely wasn't the same version of Topl it is now. And Topl will probably not be the same in a year from now, because there's a lot of evolution. Definitely. But we were picked up through that pitch by a Dutch incubator that was funded by the Dutch government, to where sustainability meets technology was the focus of this incubator. So Chris, being the one that's graduated, actually moved to the Netherlands. At that point, Chris was actually the first CEO of Topl, and so moved to the Netherlands. And then as James and I started finishing up, this was in beginning of 2018. Okay. And then we started, we got some funding out of Germany, actually, from a blockchain accelerator called Iconic. And it was at that point where we started getting a little bit of traction. We actually launched our first production-ready version of the Topl blockchain in December of 2018. That was used by a living wage farming certification group to track spices all the way from Indonesia to the Netherlands. Wow. So that was one of the first things that kind of launched. And out of that, out of what we had seen in 2018, we were actually invited back to South by Southwest to pitch the blockchain competition. Ended up getting second place, and were invited into Capital Factory. Gotcha. And so we moved the team to Austin. And so then we were in Austin and a part of Capital Factory. And then last year was our first fundraising round. And Rice really supported us in so much that they gave us free office space. We actually officed out of Lily Lab for 5-6 months. It was about 5 months. Wow. All through the summer, and a little bit after finals, beginning semester. And so we moved the team back. Obviously, anyone is game for office space, but we really loved what Houston was doing for us with regards to like funding and supporting us. We had an angel round, and that's kind of what drove a little bit more momentum in the company.
Okay.
We went out to raise 700K. Actually, ended up raising $1 million, but that momentum drove. James defended last July in 2019 his PhD, so he, as CTO, could step in much more seriously and drive the technology forward even more and make sure that the blockchain itself is more scalable, more secure. Chris was able to, take that and, use some of the funding momentum, but I ended up raising the round. So as president, I was, very much the investor relations person and started running operations somewhat. But I also had to finish my PhD. And so around February of this year, just after I defended in January, we sat down, the three of us, and we had like a deep dive into our strengths and weaknesses in the future of Topl, and said, what's the right decision for Topl going forward now that we're all full-time? Now that we've seen an evolution happen. And we actually ended up deciding that I would take over as CEO. Gotcha. And so that transition happened in March, and COVID hit, and I started raising our first venture round. So it was definitely one of the most intense years so far.
Definitely.
But that's kind of the evolution of the team. And, along the journey, we're a mass challenge company. We've, been everywhere in every different ecosystem in Houston, and we've kind of stayed true to Houston just because of the backing we've gotten. So very involved at Rice still when it comes to entrepreneurship, focused on engineering and really thinking through how do we make sure the students at Rice are educated on the blockchain front. We actually teach the course alongside Manolo Sanchez, who's one of our advisors and also a board member of Topl. So we started doing that, and now we're at a point where, there's a lot of stuff going on.
A lot of momentum.
Yes. Yeah.
And along the way, you've worked with some really interesting partners.
Yes.
Talk about some of the partnerships that have kind of helped you continue that momentum.
Yeah, so a lot of our, earliest engagements were because of our advisors.
Okay.
So one of our advisors, Chris Jarvis, actually started Impact 2030 alongside a few other people, which was the Impact 2030 is kind of the hedge between Fortune 500 companies and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals for 2030.
Gotcha.
And what they're focused on is really thinking through measuring that 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And what the impact should be and how to measure that impact. And so through that, Chris actually went and spoke at the UN last year. So we had a lot of different engagements through that. I actually spoke at the World Bank's World Agricultural Seminar this year, virtually during the summer. So we've been able to, engage with various big development organizations that are working towards the same goals and trying to achieve these things. But most of this has been through our advisors. We have a pretty strong advisory board that, comes with a lot of experience and a lot of background, and amazing credentials. But we really wanted to surround ourselves as technical founders. We wanted to surround ourselves with people that have business experience, industry experience, actual development experience, that know the challenges of some of the things we're solving in some of the most remote places in the world, so that we know where we're going.
Sure.
Some big organizations, but we're excited to be a part of some of these things.
Talk to us a little bit about some of the big bets that you've made and the key learnings that you've learned along the way.
Yeah, so one of the biggest bets we've made this year is, it's an exciting bet because, blockchains haven't really commercialized, or let's put it this way, blockchains have been commercializing while they're in R&D.
Sure.
The blockchain space itself is about 12 years old, started in 2008, and AI, machine learning, 80s, right? Even if not, no, actually earlier than that, right? So those types of technologies are only taking off now.
Absolutely.
But this space that is still such an R&D space started commercializing while it was actually an R&D. So what that means is that what we really wanted to do when we started Topl is not just build a blockchain for everyone, hope people come and build on top of it. We took a purpose-built approach and so narrowed it down and essentially just built a blockchain with unique features and functionalities for a specific purpose and industry so that we can make sure that businesses can prove their ethical and sustainable practices. Now, with that came the thing of we need to get this out to the market much quicker than a lot of blockchains that still don't have, they call it a mainnet, like they're not live yet, they're still just developing. So we launched the first mainnet in 2018 December after like a year and 250K spent. So we literally put an airplane in the air with a monkey on a wing and a fire extinguisher. It was like, we literally just put something in the air instead of like kept it in the hangar and over-engineered it. But because we had it in the air since 18 December, most of 19 was, more pilots and really just bringing more people, like hand-holding passengers to the airplane through a private like strip. But we couldn't keep that up. We realized that we couldn't like handle people to come and use the blockchain themselves. We needed to build like the commercial airline. We needed to build like everything from the ticketing all the way through to the airplane so that people can start self-onboard. So what we did earlier this year, we made a decision to build essentially like a layer on top of our blockchain, which is, we call it a blockchain as a service, BaaS solution, that allows you to access the blockchain with APIs. So very easy access for any developer that has front-end or back-end experience can just access Topl's blockchain. Wow. And so we wanted to launch this product suite that allows you to write to and read from the blockchain very easily. And that also means with that, it makes it much easier for us as people come to us, and we've kind of like rebranded the concept of SaaS. I call it now sustainability as a solution, where we started seeing companies come to us and say, okay, we have this ESG challenge or this sustainability challenge, and we need to be able to report or track our ESG or sustainability. Help us all the way from ideation to implementation and live on chain. Wow. Right? Like that's a big difference. And so we started saying, if we have this like essential gateway to the blockchain, it controls a little bit, how people access it. And it makes it much easier for any developer to build on top of Topl's blockchain and to utilize Topl's blockchain to the point that any integration also happens. So like any tracking device, any traceability platform, integrations with, we're planned integrations, SAP, QuickBooks, right? Any API access allows you to actually talk to the Topl blockchain. Now that learning made us say, we had to push a little bit like people who wanted to come on chain now and essentially wanted to just directly access the blockchain. We needed to move them forward a little bit. Okay. COVID helped, right? Because everyone kind of went into stealth mode a lot. Like most companies went into, like even the mines were closed. Like most mines around the world were at like 40 to 60% capacity because we're closing down everything. So we saw that as an opportunity to just start engineering, right? And just start building so that we can bring this product out by Q1 2021. And yes, we're on track now. So we'll launch this piece of Topl's offering by the first quarter.
That's great.
So yeah, so it was a big learning this year, and it was a big decision because we could have lost a lot of people, and we didn't. So yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about your journey raising capital and how has that progressed through the time?
Yeah, so I actually did this like very interesting segment on like how I raised it last year.
Oh, awesome!
Where they asked me to talk about like social hacking.
Okay.
And what that means is essentially when they asked me if I wanted to come and speak on this about our like pre-seed round, this like angel round. You're this deep tech company in Houston. How did you raise money out of Houston? So we actually raised about 70% of our 1 million from Houston. Wow. And very much rice adjacent people. So there's a lot of people affiliated with Rise, and I'm also proud that we have like over 40% female investors.
That is great.
But what it was really about is social hacking, right? It was going through our network itself, going through our Rise network, and starting to not necessarily go for investors, but go for advisors and mentors and people that can give us very candid feedback.
Definitely.
And see if they would fund something like this, right? See if they would back this type of solution. And a lot of my approach in the fundraising last year was more about education. We had like wine nights where we would help people, educate not on blockchain necessarily, but on early stage venture investing.
Okay.
So like if you're an angel and you want to put money in, and we had this like women's wine night, and a lot of these women wanted to put in money. They are, they are accredited investors, but they haven't done something like this before. So how do you do that? Right? How do you think through doing it? How do you make sure you diversify your portfolio? Don't give me 50K, give me 15K and give 3 other founders the same thing.
Got it.
Right? And that was something I was very passionate about. It's like I never wanted to take any investors' money that didn't understand that, venture is risky. And so that's kind of where a lot of it started, was more about thinking through having very sophisticated investors that truly understand what we're building and what we're trying to achieve, give us extremely candid feedback, and then still see if they would, fund the company.
Wow.
So we have some very impressive angel investors in our round. Some are like, I don't think I can mention a lot of their names, but yes, there is.
That's exciting.
2 clicks in Houston, and you probably find one of Topl's like angel round investors.
Wow.
But that was kind of where we started, and from there, kind of the network grew. Okay. So even from our early stage investors, I was starting to get introductions to venture funds. So this year, when I started raising in March, I actually already had started conversations with Blair Guru from Mercury Fund in January. So I started raising in March. I never thought Blair would lead a round for Topl because we're such a emerging tech focused company. And then me and him just kept a relationship going. I had to actually by June had talked to about 80 VCs.
Okay.
And every coast, it includes some of the biggest names I've actually talked to. And really wanted to start refining, how much are we raising? Why are we raising as much as we're, raising? And what is it for? What do we need it for? And Blair and I actually spent a lot of time working through that. Blair and team, me and team, walking through why, what, strategy sessions. And through that, really just clicked. And ended up saying, we want Houston to lead this. And so Blair took the lead. And so Mercury Fund's actually our lead investors on this round. And they took the biggest chunk on this round. Actually, only went out to raise 2 million, ended up raising 3.
Wow.
So it was a big oversubscription this time. I'm very grateful for a lot of, the funds that have come into this round, extremely excited about it. We'll have an announcement go out in the near future, so watch out for that. Absolutely.
Can't wait to see that.
Yeah, that's kind of, but it's been an interesting journey, and I always tell founders that, COVID, I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to raise this.
There was uncertainty there.
Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty. This not just uncertainty. This year was a year of unknowns.
Yes.
And so it was kind of one of those years where everyone was just like, what if we don't survive? And I think being a tech company and being to huddle down and say, can we focus just on tech and get this tech moving forward very quickly, even further than we would have, with, everything running in normal wheels. I think that helped us as a team to become extremely nimble, we are a very scrappy team. So we try to, save every cent, bring down the burn as quick as possible. And I have to say that kudos to the team because they all stuck with us. They believed in me, Chris and James, and we made it through. So I'm very excited about now clear strategy on what we're doing next. We have some very interesting new team members coming onto the team.
That's great.
So, yeah.
And so, as you know, you're raising this capital, what were some of the things that really stood out apart, you know, throughout that journey? Like, what did you learn about yourself, or what did you learn about the process that really resonates with you today?
Yeah, I definitely think that one of the biggest things is, interestingly, Q3 was the worst quarter for female founders to raise in since 2017.
Wow.
So it was a challenge. One of the biggest things I always talk about is, as a founder, I never really think about, you know, female versus male, like, type of questions that are being asked.
Definitely.
But there is a HBS like case study that talks about like the actual difference between preventative questions and promotional questions.
Okay.
And the study actually shows that women tend to get a lot more preventative questions asked than promotional questions. And so one of the, you know, being a statistician, I was very data driven. And so I started seeing this happen. And one of the tricks that they kind of talk through is, how do you turn a preventative question into a promotional answer?
Okay.
So that was something I learned about myself, is how can I, you know, re-engineer this in my favor, because I can tee it up. I can see a preventative question coming, and know there's some biases involved, and then actually swing it around.
So we've talked about, you know, the transition in the company and where you're at today. Let's talk a little bit about where you're going and some of the things that you see down the road. We talked about the FDA rule, right? And how that new rule is, you know, for the next 10 years, is really going to change supply chain in food. So talk a little bit about that new FDA rule, some of the goals and the, you know, the missions it's set out to meet, and then how do you see blockchain kind of folding into that?
Yeah, so the FDA rule you're talking about is essentially, like, summarized. It is a rule that we need to, there's a list of products, about, I think it's about 10, 15 products that have to be track and trace from source to sale. We need to know everything about that, everything that product touches. We also have to track and trace from source to sale. Now, what that means is it's going to essentially leapfrog the food industry into having more technology solutions, having more track and trace solutions in place, digitizing a lot of what they're doing so that they can prove the claims that they're making. And so with that comes the actual need for digital, you know, transformation. And the food space is very well known for not being the most sustainable space. Not being, you know, the FDA rule was also specifically, it's not just around compliance and, you know, making sure that our products are, you know, we don't have recalls and things like that. It also has to do with the social and environmental practices around the food. And so that was definitely something that came about. And so blockchain technology is an opportunity to leapfrog over the legacy technology that might be existent in like some manufacturing or some industrial processes. And you can actually get over, you know, if you are using no tech or like low tech or even some legacy tech, you can jump over that and leapfrog into using track and trace tools powered by blockchains that allows you to actually get to a, you know, provenanced food chain.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I always joke and I talk about, you know, you can get the Fitbit for food, because that's ultimately what you want to be able to track. You want to track everything about the food. So the only way you do that is, you know, write a unique protocol that allows you to, like, something as simple as Fitbit that measures movement and tracking environments. So I think that's where the future is. You know, we need to start building tech solutions that allows food to move forward into, you know, actually abiding by the FDA's rules.
Definitely.
So
yes.
yeah.
And also because it's all intertwined, right? When you look at, you know, the healthcare system and the supply chain and what we're eating, climate change, all of these things are all intertwined in a way that it's an ecosystem, and they all rely on each other in one way or another. And
Oh,
so,
absolutely. I mean, like this is, yes, I 100%. When people ask me like, why aren't you guys like looking at carbon? And I'm always like, but we are. The food supply chains, the fashion supply chains, all of them are the most carbon intensive, other than energy,
definitely.
right? Fashion supply chains have the biggest emission footprint,
Yes.
right? So a lot of these actual carbon and climate change type movements that we're trying to enable and empower come out of supply chains. And you can, because of blockchain technology, you can actually be tracking the environmental factors, the carbon offsets or the carbon emissions alongside that digital twin. So you can actually be tracking your carbon footprint as you're tracking your social and labor practices, as you're tracking your non-GMO status, as you're tracking your actual physical twin in the digital space. So you can do all of those things simultaneously. You don't have to, track in different systems. So yeah, you can track your carbon while you track your food.
Yes. Yeah. You can go in and look at where something was sourced or how it got to the grocery store that you're buying it from, and track everything back to the first mile, right? We talked about the first mile.
And the footprint even of that tracking mechanism, like what is, how much emissions did the actual truck that moved the food from point A to point B, how much did they emit?
Wow.
And then how do you offset that? Right. So yeah, no, you can definitely, like, talking about the future, it's exactly it. Like, how do we track that? Right. Like for me, one of the biggest things was I was trained as a financial engineer, like as a quant.
Okay.
And so just before we started Topl in 2017, I got an internship as a quant. To one of my jobs was to build a multi-asset, like themed portfolio. So like think a wallet with like a bunch of different types of companies that have ESG themed pieces. So like a company with an ESG focus of X and a company with an ESG focus of Y. And so putting it together, a portfolio of companies that have made these ethical and sustainable claims.
Yes.
Where do you find that data? There's no Bloomberg for impact.
Sure.
Right. And so it was really like one of the things I had to do is really go find out where we get that data, where we source that data so that we can find the companies that need to sit in these, like, these public companies, who's doing what, why are they doing it? But how do we know? How do we know that they're actually doing the things that they're claiming? And so for me, it was a thing before we can transact on ESG and behaviors in ESG, before we can actually, bet on companies that are making these claims and are doing these things, we need to track and trace their behaviors.
Okay.
And so for me, that's where it starts. It's let's first track and trace everything that they're doing and the claims that they're making. Let's create defensible self-certification opportunities so that those derivative products, those actual like impact credits, those, just like a carbon credit, can become something that can be, the measure that you look at when you look at a specific company and you want to say, oh, they have this ESG status because I can see this and this and this and this and this specific sustainable development goal was achieved in here in this supply chain they specifically looked at labor practices. In this supply chain they specifically looked at environmental impact, and so now you can see these essential impacts being tracked alongside the actual good that's moving. And I always think that we need to, when you buy yourself a bicycle, like a Peloton bike, or you buy yourself a Nike shoes or whatever, we have to start seeing those products as companies.
Yes.
And those companies have specific, supply chains in place and specific practices along those supply chains in place. And I truly believe instead of having a still frame sticker of, this has this certification, I can have a moving picture of what really happened from start to finish.
Yes.
And if I can have a moving picture, then it's much easier for me to build a multi-asset portfolio with that company in it. And so, yeah, before we can transact, we have to track and trace first.
Wow. Yeah, that's just hearing how emerging tech is going to impact, food through the FDA rule, and how it's going to impact the first mile. All of these different things, it makes you realize how much we have just relied on the company to tell us what they do, right? And there's no one there to hold them accountable along the way.
Yeah, but now their capital is starting to.
Yes.
And so their investors are pushing them. So you are right, like the RFPs, like the request for more transparency, the request for more actual proof that, what is happening is true. The claims that you're making as a company, their investors, these conscious capital is pushing down and saying, this is how we're going to make a more sustainable future. So yes, you are 100% right. We have been trusting actual companies, but the conscious consumer is questioning that. And now we're getting the push from the other side too, where the capital is starting to say, I'm not investing in this until you can truly prove to me this is true. Now, this is a burden for most companies. As much as we would like this to happen, it is a burden because it is a, reporting burden. It is a tracking burden. It is, and that's why we want to try and make the certification process so much more efficient so that they can drastically reduce the operational cost it will be for you to do that. But then at the same time, think about long-term accountability. Is your funder is not going to fund unless they have a time series of data.
Yeah.
So that's something that, so there's push on both sides right now. There's push and pull. You have the push from the investor and the pull from the consumer. So companies have only one way to go, and that's a very transparent and, honest future. So I always say that, with Topl, I want it to be synonymous with trust. We need to be able to, when you see Topl, you're thinking trust, transparency, traceability. That's what you need to be viewing.
I love it. Really cool to see, just from an innovation perspective, where you're leading the charge, right? And how the regulation is being put in place today for you to change the world, right? One of the things you've set out to do.
No, for you to change the world and for me to help you prove it.
Oh, okay. I like that. I'm all about changing the world.
Exactly. That's what I realized when I was traveling around the world. A lot of companies are changing the world. They just have zero way to become the challenger and take on the incumbent that they have to be able to differentiate. And how do we do that? We help them prove what they're doing is real. That's the only way we do it. But yes, you all can change the world.
Absolutely.
I just want to be a part of making sure that we prove that that's true.
And so the last question I'll ask you is, you're a collegiate athlete. You've been an athlete your whole life. Now in this stage of your life, where do you get your competitive fix?
Performance incentives.
Okay.
I mean, that's why I think what you guys are building, right? With the gamification of, teams and companies. I love it. I think that is the way a lot of my team are actually athletes. So there's a lot of rugby players in my team.
Great.
A lot, my marketing director, my community brand director, she's actually a swimmer, collegiate swimmer from Rice. So we have a team of athletes. So so it's mostly, I'm married to my work, get it?
Yes.
Every investor would love this, and that is who I am. But I think it's more about my work is actually how I'm going to change the world too. So
yes, and you're racing now to, you're in a race. You're racing to be the first commercial blockchain company.
Yeah, or easily commercial blockchain. I don't know. We'll see. There is some other tools out there, so I might give them credit.
Yes.
But I think that we can build some strategy around commercializing blockchain that could become the norm. So I'd love to do that.
Absolutely. Kim, thank you so much. You've shared so much information with us today. Really excited about where you guys are going. Excited to see you guys grow and really just make the impact to the world. So Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for checking us out. We can't wait to catch you next time. Hey there. Thanks for checking out the Closers Coffee YouTube channel. Make sure to follow us for all the latest Closers content. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more. We can't wait to catch you next time.